Let's begin with tefillah that the schus of our learning should be for the hostages to be returned immediately, and protection of our soldiers and the people and the innocents in this terrible conflict.
Right.
So let us begin from here. We're going to go back again and look at what we learned with Reb Tzvi, and then go on. We got up to the next part, but I'm going to ask each, or anyone who wants to help me explain this. I want to make sure that we're following the Gemara, right? So it's a little bit subtle. So earlier we had Rabbah, who said that the Kotevet Hagasa is a little bit bigger than a Kibetza. And now we have Rav Tzvi. He says Kotevet Hagasa Shamru Chasra Me Kibetza. The Kotevet Hagasa of the Mishnah, they said in the Mishnah, that's less than a Kibetza. Did none. And then he or the Gemara for him brings a proof from this Mishnah in. So what's the Mishnah say? Beit Shammai omrim seor b'kazayit, chametz b'kikotevet. Seor is measured in kazayit, and chametz is in a kikotevet. So what is that regarding? What are these shiurim for? The seor and the chametz.
So or would be sort of something like sourdough starter. It's like something
Yeah,
one
but
can
what's the shiur for? Why are we measuring them?
Pesach, of course.
For what purpose on Pesach?
What quantity you are permitted to have in your house without being a chayav.
Okay, so actually we should put it, that's almost exactly right, but you wouldn't say what would be permitted, because nothing is permitted. But at what point will you be chayav?
Yes.
Right. So what's the minimum shiur that you will need to be chayav a chatat on Pesach for not having destroyed before Pesach? So seor is kazayit. So those are the shiurim. So if you have a kazayis of seor, you're chayav, and if you have a kotevet of chametz, you would be chayav. Right. The havinan ba. So then we challenge this. My taima to Beit Shammai. So what's the reasoning of Beit Shammai? Nichtov rachmana chametz v'lo bai seor. Let the Torah write chametz, and we don't need seor. Meaning what?
The fact that the Torah writes both chametz and seor instead of just one of them means that it's interpreted as being a different shiur for both of them.
Okay, so it's like you're reading ahead. That's fine. I'm actually doing this on an even more granular level. So what's the reason for Beit Shammai? Because the Torah could have written, let the Torah write chametz, and it would not have needed to write seor. That is, there's an underlying assumption that if the Torah had written just the word chametz, that's all it would have. That's all that we would have needed to know. And what would I have said? So let's say the Torah just wrote chametz and not seor. So what would I have said then about seor? Would I have thought that seor is permissible, or what would I have thought about seor?
I mean, it would be almost like a kal v'chomer. Like if chametz is prohibited, then kal v'chomer seor would be prohibited, since from seor one can make a large quantity of chametz.
Okay, so that's what the Gemara says. So this is what we would have said: Uma chametz she'en chimutzo kasher asur b'kazayit Seor so kasher lo kol shekain. So if the Torah had not written Seor, then I would have made this kal v'chomer. I would have been done a kal v'chomer. I would have said, just as chametz, whose chimtzos is not kasher, right? So the level of fermentation is not hard, meaning it's not as intense. That's the Torah forbids, even if you have a kazayit. But if seor shechimutzo kasher, seor which has chimutz kasher, right? It's a more intense fermentation. Lo kol sheken, wouldn't that all the more so be asur? And if that's what would have happened, if the Torah had written chametz and not seor, and then I would have made this kal v'chomer, then what would I have said about the shiur of the seor? Right, the Torah would say chametz is asur. I would say kol shekain seor is asur. So then, what would be the shiur for the seor?
It would be the same.
So presumably, it would be the same. And we'll talk about that in a second. In other words, this is the question: when you have a kal v'chomer in such a circumstance, does the kal v'chomer mean that it has the same din as the one that I'm being done from? In other words, is it going to be the same in this case as the chametz? Or would I say that since chimutzo kasher may, and all the more so, it should be asur, maybe that implies that it also has a different shear altogether. But we don't, our assumption is not like that. Our assumption is going to be like Michael just said. So midipalginhu rachmana, since the Torah differentiates between them, limdalach, it teaches you shiuro shelzeh lo keshiro shelzeh. It teaches you that they have different shiurim. Seor b'kazayit, chametz b'kekotevet. Seor is kazayit, and chametz is b'kekotevet. So now, so we followed this through sort of step by step. Let's understand this last step. By virtue of the fact that the Torah singled out or mentions by name both chametz and seor, it tells me that their shiurim are different. How does it tell me that the shiurim are different? What, in other words, what's the limud? How would you put that? How do you understand that?
If the Torah had not mentioned Su'ur, we would have assumed it would have been part of Chametz. And since, we would assume it would have been part of Chametz. So the fact that it distinguished it is telling us it's telling us something special about, or something different than the Su'ur is different than Chametz.
Okay, so it's really just like, but it's a continuation of what you said a moment ago, that if the Torah had written just chametz and not seor, then I would say that seor is also asur because it's chamutz, but I would just say it would be like chametz, would have the same din as chametz. The fact that the Torah goes out of its way to say that seor is by name is asur, so then it implies a differentiation in shiur. Why is that? Because otherwise, what's the point of mentioning it? Right? The point is, and so I just went through this this exercise of saying there could be a kal v'chomer here, like Michael Werner said. There could be a kal v'chomer here had the Torah not written seor. So you see the underlying assumption here is going to be, as it is throughout Midrash and Halachic Midrash, every word is going to be significant. So the Torah, if the Torah couldn't have put in Seor Stam, because then it's extraneous, because if it was going to have the same din as Chametz, it didn't have to write it at all. So the fact that it did write it tells me that, as Michael Schwartz just said, that I have to, it must be telling me something special about it. Now, so it's going to tell me that they have different shiurim. So here's the question. So the Gemara says, so they have different shiurim. So Seor is going to be b'kazayit, and Chametz is b'kikotevet. So now, this last line, that a Seor is b'kazayit and Chametz is b'kikotevet, how do I come to that conclusion? In other words, granted, I come to the conclusion that each thing, Chametz and Seor, have different shiurim, but how do I conclude, A, that Seor is, that, how do I conclude which shiur goes to which thing? And B, which particular shiurim? How does the Gemara come to the conclusion that specifically Seor is b'kazayit and Chametz is b'kikotevet? All I knew before the Gemara says that is that Chametz and Seor are going to have different shiurim. So how do I know how to assign which shiur to which thing? And how do I know to assign those particular shiurim?
So, I mean, it seems pretty clear here why Chametz has a bigger amount.
Why is that? Why would that be clear?
Well, since, I mean, Seor is what one makes Chametz from. It's more intense. One can generate a lot of Chametz from a little bit of Seor. So presumably won't be Chayav for Chatat with a lesser quantity.
You don't mean the less, wait.
I mean, one would be Chayav for having a lesser quantity of Seor, because with that lesser quantity, one can generate a lot of Chametz.
Okay, so let's take that. So based on this idea that Chivutzot Kasheh, I'm going to assign the smaller shiur to Seor. And that leaves me with Chametz, so Chametz has to be a bigger shiur. Okay, so that argument only gets me so far. In other words, it's an important argument. It answers one of the questions. One of the questions is, how do I know which shiur should I assign to which substance, to Chametz or Seor? So I'll say, generally speaking, I'm going to have to assign the smaller shiur to the Seor and the larger shiur to Chametz. But it still doesn't tell me why those specific shiurim. So for this, now let's look at Rashi. Let's see.
Shel?
Yes.
Oh, I came late, but what's the difference between Chametz and so maybe he explains it, I guess.
No, that's okay. What's the question?
What's the difference between Chametz and Seor?
You mean
Seor is Chametz, no? I don't know.
Okay, so we discussed this not just today, I think we also mentioned last week, but yes, so Michael Werner, what's the difference between Chametz and Seor?
Basically, Chametz is like the edible material. And Seor is what you generate the Chametz with. So it'd be like there's some between sort of bread and sourdough starter.
Right. So if you make bread, you start with Seor. So what's Seor? It's when you take it, like Michael said, it's a sourdough starter, what we call now in English now a sourdough starter. And that's just, you take flour and water, you mix it together, and you leave it sit for a few days. And then we know chemically that the natural yeasts that are just in the air and in your ambience are going to mix with that, and it starts to go sour, it starts to ferment, and then at a certain point it becomes, right, very fermented. And then if you take a small amount of that and mix it into a dough that's made up of flour and water, fresh flour and fresh water, it will make that dough rise. But the starter itself is not something that you eat.
This is what you call today the shmarim. You buy it in the supermarket.
Okay, so the shmar. So I will note that shmarim, right? Baker's yeast takes the place of seor, but the commercial shmarim themselves are not necessarily seor, because they may not be built on a base of chametz. The way commercial shmarim are made, they don't necessarily start with any kind of a grain at all. There are different. I looked into this really a long time ago. Both the fresh yeast, which comes like in a little cube in Israel, or the granular kind, those things are not necessarily chametz at all.
You can buy them on Pesach and use
Well,
them and do a cake with them? I don't know. I don't think so.
No. In theory, in other words, in halachic theory, you could own them on Pesach, but you can't use them because you only use them to make a dough rise. So there's nothing you can do with them, but you don't necessarily have to get rid of them for Pesach. But if you have sourdough starter, that you have to get rid of. You have, right, so people who make sourdough bread on a regular basis, there are a couple of methods, but the most common method is to have a liquid sourdough starter that you have to add some flour and a little water to every once in a while, and you have to pour off the excess every once in a while. You have to maintain it on a day-to-day basis. So that you have to get rid of. And in some, like historically, in some communities, because those starters are valuable, right? Because they've developed a particular taste over time. Yeah, no, but people who bake bread, it's a big deal, actually. And so in Jewish communities, in different Jewish communities, in different times in history, that would be something that Jews would not throw away. That would be something they would sell or give away to their non-Jewish neighbors in hopes of getting it back after Pesach. There are people who have sourdough starters that are like over 100 years old. It's a little stump, and they develop unique taste.
And you think that different bakeries do have their own seor?
Yeah, nowadays that's true. Using seor as part of the baking process went out of fashion once commercial yeast became available because it was much easier. But there are some places that always used it. There was a bakery this is a bit of a digression. There's a bakery in San Francisco. I was only in San Francisco once, but I saw they had this bakery there. I don't remember the name. I think everyone in San Francisco knows this bakery. It's a big, big bakery. It's like a huge place. You can see the bread. They have it. It has like this really high vaulted ceiling. And the bread comes out of the ovens. You can see it going on a conveyor belt above your heads. It's really fascinating. They've been making sourdough bread for over 100 years. And as far as I know, I think that they've been, it's all based on the same starter. I'm sorry, Michael Werner, did you want to add something?
No, I just remembered the name of the bakery, which is neither here nor there right now.
Oh, what's the name of the bakery?
I think it's Bowden, something, I mean.
I think you're right. That sounds right. Very good. Anyway,
I did tell you about the friend of mine who actually came up with a really brilliant solution. He'd read that in Egyptian tombs they'd been able to sprout grain, and they'd been able to sprout grain that had been Egyptian tombs since. So he basically had a potter make a very porous, like terracotta jar, and he took a seor and rubbed it into the terracotta until it was like invisible, but it was actually present in the clay. And then after after Pesach, he was able to add it, and it actually became actually fermented. He was actually able to add dough and that fermented.
right, I understand. Is that okay?
So basically, it's like it once been rubbed into terracotta, it was invisible. You couldn't see it anymore.
Yeah, I'm not sure that gets you out of Balyarai Balyamatse. And there's, but okay, I understand what he's doing.
Shay?
It could be that's okay. Anyway, I just wanted to throw in one other thing, and that is the other method of maintaining seor. There's a method of keeping it dry. You can keep it dry for, I don't know, months or years at a time. You make like a small cake that starts off relatively dry, and you can let it completely dry out, which is not dissimilar to this idea of trying to get the terracotta to absorb it. But in terms of holding it on Pesach, for sure, if it's a separate cake, you have to get rid of it. Paul, what was your point?
In the pitot, there is no seor, I guess, because they don't, there's a lot of air.
Well, no, I'll tell you something. It depends on the kind of pita. Because like stam pitot, it doesn't, yesh v'yesh. So like you can make lafot that are completely without any kind of chomer tofeach, without any kind of rising agent. But the smaller round pitot, those are usually made with a risen dough. So they're different. It depends what kind of pizza you're making. Anyway, we don't have to
So they should be kosher Pesach if they have no seor.
So yesh v'yet, and there's some of them are. That is, the
In the Veidot HaMizrach already ate. They have matzot which are soft.
yes,
like a pita.
exactly. So that's what I mean. And I make essentially pitot like that for Leil HaSeder. I do that myself. I make them, I try to do it every year on Erev Pesach. It's ideal to have your matzah baked on Erev Pesach. And I have, I just make them on top of my stove. Anybody who's interested, I can tell you how. Somebody made a nice video showing you how to do it. But if you watch as I have if you watch the people who make pitot on a sage, right? So if you know what a sage is, it looks like an upside down. It's like a wok that you turn upside down. You put a very hot flame underneath, and that's traditionally here in the Middle East. That's how people make pitot. You put it on the outside of that. It's heated from underneath, and they'll bake within, within a minute or two, because it's a very, very hot, flame underneath. And I just remember one time, and I think it was Erev Pesach. I don't think he was making them for Pesach, but because it was close to Pesach, it was a guy in Farin section near Mea Sharim, who was making these kinds of pitot. And basically, if you have the dough, if you mix up the dough with just flour and water, and you put it on a sage, that would be kosher for Pesach, assuming that the sage is kosher for Pesach and all of that. you could do that. Anyway, this is a bit of a digression, but let's get back to our. It's okay because whatever helps you to remember the Gemara is going to be helpful. Okay, so we're left with with this question. Shiro shozeh loka shiro shozeh soor p'gesayv chametz b'kikotzevet. So Michael Werner gave us the argument for why the soor should be the smaller shiur and why chametz should be the larger shiur. But we still don't know exactly why do we choose these shiurim. So here, let's look at Rashi. Rashi says, Shiro shel zeh lo k'shiro shel zeh korchach dechametz nafish mikazayit v'lahachi katav soor. He says, perforce, right? You must say that chametz in this context is going to be bigger than a kazayit, and that's why it says soor. What does he mean? If the Torah hadn't written soor, the gemar mechametz, and it learned from chametz, hava amina dayu lavo min hadin liot kenidon. It's sufficient to derive from the din that it should be like the nidon. Okay, now does anybody know that phrase? Daya lavo minadin liot kanidon. Are you familiar with this? Okay, so we're gonna. This is a more important digression, and I thought about the best way to present this. So this is a principle that's real. Has to do with the part of the conversation. It was before you came, Paul, but when Michael Schwartz had made the argument earlier that like this, when the Gemara said, let the Torah write chametz and not soor, and I would have derived soor from a kol shekeh. I would have derived it from a kal v'chomer. So now the question is, when you have a kal v'chomer, so what are the effects of the kal v'chomer? So here, if we have, I'm going to give you a classic example that's not strictly speaking from halacha, but it is a good, it's a good way to understand the concept. Wait a second, I had it. Now I just have to figure out which. Here, 1 second. I'll share the screen. I'm going to bring you from a story that you all know. So what's the story? The story is here in Bamidbar at the end of Bahalotcha. Or in Bahalotcha, right? So what happened in Bahalotcha? We have the story of Miriam and Aaron. But the Deber Miriam v'Aaron b'Moshe odot ha'isha kushida shelakach v'isha kushida lakach, right? So they're speaking about Aaron, presumably. So this is either lashon hara or at the very least it's rechilut. And they say vayamru harakach b'Moshe diber Hashem helugam banu diber vayishma Hashem. So we're going to skip down. So what happens? And God, right? So God has his exchange with them. Vayomer Hashem pitom al Moshe v'Aaron v'al Miriam, tzu shlochtechem el moed vayitzu shloshtam. Vayered Hashem ba'amud anan vayamod petach ha'ohel vayikra Aaron u'Miriam vayitzu shneim. Vayomer shimu na dvarai miyad neviachem Hashem. Miyad neviachem Hashem b'mara elav et vada. Right, so Hashem says that he talks to his Nevi'im through a dream. Except for Moshe. Lo chen avdi Moshe b'chol beiti ne'amanu. Pe'o pe'a daber bo mareh v'lo b'chidot. And tmunat Hashem yabit. Madua lo yiretem Right, so here's where we see very explicitly the difference between Nevuat Moshe and Nevuah of other Nevi'im. Vayicharaf Hashem bam vayelach. Ve'anan sar me'al ohel, and what happened? Miriam is mitzurat kashele. So Aaron says to Moshe, Al na tashet alenu chatat asher nolanu v'asher chatanu, right? A very famous line that we know from Slichot and parts of the liturgy. Do not put upon us a sin that we were foolish, about which we were foolish, and about which we have sinned. Al na tihi kameh, tasher b'tzeto me'rechem imo, ve'yachel chatzi b'saro. And so Moshe replies with a tefillah, and he says, Kel na refana. Okay. That's just to remind us of the basic story. Now, what does Hashem say to Moshe? Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Va'avia yarok yarak b'fanea, halo tikalem shivat yamim. So, if her father had spat in front of her, would we not lock her up for 7 days? Tisager shivat yamim michutz lamachaneh v'yachar te'aseh. So let her be not locked up, but muskar, right? That she should be separated out from the rest of the people for 7 days outside of the camp, and afterwards she could be brought in. Okay, so what's happening here? Hashem is making a kal v'chomer. This is a kal v'chomer. What is he saying? Look, what Miriam did was a sin. Had she done this sin to her own father, wouldn't she be locked up for 7 days? So what's the kal v'chomer? Finish out the kal v'chomer. That's the kal. What's the chomer?
If she has offended Moshe.
If she has,
I mean, if she's done likewise to Moshe.
is that she did it to Moshe or
to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it's not entirely clear.
Okay, so we're going to go with the idea that, in other words, so it's either you could argue that maybe it's Moshe because Moshe is maybe greater than a father, but more likely we're going to say that it was an insult to the Kadosh Baruch Hu himself. Here, the Kadosh Baruch Hu himself is coming down, and and the Kadosh Baruch Hu brought a cloud down and put tzarat on Miriam, right? So the insult is to Hashem. I'm not saying it's not. It's also to Moshe, but it's also to Hashem. So what's the point? The kal is if she had insulted her father. The chomer, the kal v'chomer of the chomer of the kal v'chomer is that she insulted Hashem. So if she gets punishment X, a certain punishment for insulting her father, all the more so she's going to get a punishment for insulting the Kadosh Baruch Hu. So now the question is, what should that punishment be? In other words, if the insult is essentially greater, because now she's insulted the Kadosh Baruch Hu, maybe I should say that the punishment should be greater.
It should be greater.
Okay, so that you could say that's the question when you have this kal v'chomer. So granted, you have the chomer, right? So everything should be more stringent, should be od yoter. So maybe for the Kadosh Baruch Hu, she should be stricken with leprosy for 2 weeks, or for 5 weeks, or it should be something bigger.
You ask if it should be proportionate or something like this.
Yeah, so thank you. In other words, maybe I'll say if this is a more stringent sin, then the onesh should be in proportion to the stringency of the sin. But what is
they
the
say today they call this midat yud. So
midat yud? I don't know that.
No, that's the whole thing, which was all this dispute, which was about midat yud of the Beit HaMishpat HaElyon. If this is midati.
Midat yud. I'm sorry.
Midat yud.
Midat yud. Okay, it's the connection. Right, proportionality. So leaving aside the bagats for a moment, but what does the Kadosh Baruch Hu say? What in fact does he say the punishment for Miriam is?
The same.
It's the same.
The same, yeah.
Okay. So now let's plug in the nomenclature. Let's plug in the words. So we have the just to keep in mind. So we have the term kal v'chomer. So the other terms that we need to know to apply to a kal v'chomer is din and nidon. Right? So the din is going to be the conclusion that you come to in the kal v'chomer. The nidon is the basis for the kal v'chomer, or to put it in other words, the nidon is the kal, and the din is the chomer. That's just the term, and that's what I'm looking for, terminology. I have the din, and I have the nidon. So the din is the conclusion, and the nidon is what I'm concluding from. It's that which is being discussed. So here, what's being discussed is the onesh of Miriam. So we start with a case that's kal yoter, which is if she had insulted her father. So that's the kal, that's the nidon, that's what I'm judging. And then the din, the conclusion is going to be the din is going to be what Miriam's actual punishment is going to be, based on the fact that her sin was yoter chamur. All right, so I could say kal v'chomer, that, like we just said, that just so we know that she's going to be chayevet an onesh for insulting the Kadosh Baruch Hu, but maybe maybe like you said a moment ago, maybe the onesh has to be proportional to the severity of the crime. But the Torah says shivat yamim, right? Tisager shivat yamim. So I see that just like in the nidon, she was going to get 7 days. It's enough for her to get 7 days in the din. Let's look at Rashi on this pasuk. This is what Rashi says. V'avia yarok yarak bifaneh, v'imavia herala panim zoafot, halot tikalem shivat yamim. Right. So Rashi's filling out the pasuk for us. If the father had spat in front of her, meaning if the father had shown her panim zoafot, like a distressed face, the father was really angry at her. Haloti kalem shivat yamin. Wouldn't she get locked up for 7 days? Kal v'chomer l'shchina yudalad yo. So kal v'chomer, I would say, certainly she's going to get punished, and she should get punished twice as much. Ella dayo lavo min hadin liyot kenidon. It's enough to come from the conclusion, from the judgment, to be like that which was being judged to begin with. The fikach, af b'nezivati, even though she insulted me, the Kadosh Baruch Hu, tisager shivat yamin. she's only going to be in Hesker for 7 days. So these are the two principles. You have the principle of Kal v'chomer, and then we have this principle of Dayo ladin lavo min adin liyot kanidam. This is at the Rashi. So this is what Rashi's talking about there. It comes up in
So instead of using a proportion, you use the minimum.
You're going to use the minimum, or in other words, because see, but so this is always going to be, this is the conceptual issue when you make a kol sheken, when you make a kal v'chomer. Do I increase in this case, we're talking about punishing someone. So if I have a case that of let's say chet, that's more severe than the one I'm judging from, does that mean, so I'll say certainly there will be a punishment, but do I have to increase the punishment in proportion to the crime? And the principle appears elsewhere in the Mishnah. The Mishnah uses this, and whether or not you invoke for a short, we call this second part of it dayo, right? So dayo is short. Dayo lavo min hadin liyot kanidon. It's just a shorthand. We just say dayo, and it comes up in the Mishnah. We don't have. You may have learned this Mishnah. I'm guessing Michael Schwartz. He must have learned this Mishnah. But this is it's a machloket tanaim about if and when you invoke dayo. It's not always clear when you're going to. It's not muskam, I should say. It's not agreed upon, and you can take a second and look at this. Shor hamazik b'shut hanizak ketzad nagach nagaf nashach rabatz ba'at b'shut rabim mishalem chatzi nezek. B'shut hanizak, Rabbi Tarfon omer nezek shalem, v'chachamim omrim chatzi nezek. So maybe we shouldn't delve into this too much, but I'm guessing that you've learned this. This is a question really in Pshat in the Torah about if you have a shore that does damage in the on somebody else's property. Right, so the difference between doing damage in a public space, doing damage on somebody else's property, right? Because public property, everyone has permission to go to public property. So the shore, let's say the shore damages something, or somebody damages another shore in a public space. They both had permission to be there. But the shore, let's say, goes into somebody else's property and does damage, it didn't have permission to be there. So you would expect that that there's at least a possibility that the punishment is going to be higher when it goes into private property. So it's actually a machloket, right? So shor mazik b'shut hanizak, everybody, right? B'shuta, how does that work? So we start off with the case of shor mazik b'shuta rabim. So if the shore does any of these things, it was nagach, nashach, ravat, ba'at, if it does any of these things and does damage, if it's in the Reshuta Rabim, he pays chatzi nezek. We learned that out also. He pays chatzi nezek. But the Torah doesn't explicitly say what happens in Reshuta Nizak. So Rabbi Tarfon says nezek shalem. He pays more in private property. He pays twice as much. Chachamim omim chatzi nezek. Chachamim say no. He only pays chatzi nezek, the same as if he had done it in Reshuta Rabim. Amarahem Rabbi Tarfon. And now Rabbi Tarfon makes a kal v'chomer. Uma b'makom shehakal al hashen shehekel al hashen ve'al haregel b'shuta rabim shehu patur hechmir lehem b'shut hanizak l'shalem nezek shalem makom shehechmir al hakeren b'shuta rabim l'shalem chatzi nezek Eino din shenachmir alea b'shut hanizak l'shalem nezek shalem. Okay, this is getting a little more detailed than I care to go into now, but he makes a kal v'chomer to explain why it should be nezek shalem. Amru lo dayo lavo min adin liot kenidon. It's sufficient for us to derive from the din to be that which we started with, to be like the kal. Ma b'shut rabim chatzi nezek, af b'shut hanizak chatzi nezek. Anyway, and then he goes on. It's a more detailed conversation. I would just bring it up.
So the proportionality is not a principle. You are not obliged to go according to this proportionality, but at least you should go according to the minimum.
You'll
So
go
this is
according
what
to
you
the
mean?
minimum. So what you see from the Mishnah is actually it's a machloket between Rabbi Tarfon and the Chachamim. Rabbi Tarfon says no, you have to increase. You'll increase proportionally, or if not, I mean, yeah, okay. Anyway, it'll be greater, right? In other words, if the sin is greater, or if the Aveira, the Isur is greater, then you're going, or here, if the Nezek is considered to be greater in some way, not that it did more damage, but it did damage in a place that should be more obviously Chayav, then you have to increase the punishment. And Chachamim say Dayo. They say no. In other words, that's all I get out of the Kal V'chomer. And it goes on. So the Dayo comes up a few places in the Mishnah and in the Gemara. So the reason I wanted
But it depends on the circumstances, that if you should use the proportionality instead of the minimum.
it really boils down to it, not necessarily. It really boils down to it was a machloket generally, and when you was a machloket generally whether you invoke Dayo or not, and
This should be important for Dayanim, or even today. Or
yeah, of course, it's very important. It's a very important principle. So, generally, we hold Dayo. Generally speaking, we invoke Dayo. In other words, so it's like you said a second ago. In other words, Dayo tells me, I'm going to now impose, let's say in this case, I'm going to impose a punishment for something that's not explicit. So it's enough for me to do the minimum. And more than that, I don't know. So if we take, so when you think about it, you take the example with Miriam, so the Kadosh Baruch Hu goes out of his way to say Dayo, as it were, right? Because if not, then what exactly would be proportional? Rashi offers up that it would be 14 days. It would be twice as much. But it's Kadosh Baruch Hu. It could be a year. It could be the rest of her life. In other words, it's not immediately obvious. Now, if we were to take the time, which we're not going to do, to go through Rebbe Tarfon's argument, we'll see more explicitly why in that case he goes from the nidon of chatzi nezek to nezek shalem. There, it makes sense within the particular context that he brings that it's going to be twice as much, as it were. It's going to be he has to pay full damages and not half damages, but it's not always so clear. So that's also an argument in general. Look, we have a principle that in the Gemara that right, tafasta merube lo tafasta, tafasta miyuta tafasta. Right? Do you know this saying? It's the idea is that if you literally means right, tafasta meruba lo tafasta. If you try to grab onto the greater, you haven't actually taken hold. But if you try to grab onto the minimum, that's something you can hold. All right. So now you're Michael Schwartz. You're remembering it.
We came across this once before, at least once before, I remember.
Yes. So an example of that, you don't have to get to a kal v'chomer, but an example of that is wherever the Torah says lashon rabim about something, and it doesn't tell me anything more, I'm going to assume that it means two. Because more than that, I can't say. I just know that it's more than one. So that's always going to, unless the Torah goes out of its way to specify a number, and it just says lashon rabim, it just gives a plural form, I have to assume that means two, because I don't know more than that. So it's a similar concept to this idea of daya. It's similar conceptually. All I know the kal v'chomer is that I'm going to apply, in this case, all I know about the kal v'chomer is that it's going to tell me to apply a punishment to something that wasn't specifically mentioned in the Torah. And so it's going to be sufficient for me to say it should get whatever, the minimum. Paul, what did you want to say?
You said, ein tachat ein v'shen tachat shen. This is a principle of proportionality, which goes against this. No?
Wait, why?
Even if it's money.
No, wait a second.
It's considered to be money, but you have to pay much more for an eye than you have to pay for an.
No, but there I'll say that. Why do you think it goes against what I just said?
Because if the nezek is greater, then you have to pay much more than.
No, but that's
Ein is a nezek which is much bigger than the tooth.
So first of all, it's going to depend. But let's say bonagid that's always going. Let's say that's going to be the case. But that does all that tells me is that you pay nezek according to whatever you damaged.
Yes, so it's proportional.
No, it's not proportional. It's one. The proportion is 1 to 1. It's 1 to 1. If you did ayin, you pay for ayin. If you did shein, right? If you did shein, you do shein. It doesn't say that if the Torah just said shein tachat shein, and then I poked out somebody's eye, then I would have to think, do I pay the same as shein, or do I pay more for an eye? I'm not putting that right. Look, in general, the idea in damages is you pay for the damage. It's not a question of proportionality as such. It's that you're trying to replace that which you damaged. So that doesn't go against this idea that you increase, that you wouldn't necessarily increase the punishment if the circumstances are more severe. So here, let's bring it back to our case of Seor and Chametz. Well, the argument that we made earlier, we differentiate for the purposes of this discussion. We're going to differentiate between Seor and Chametz in this way, that Seor is chimutzo kasher, and Chametz is stam chimutz, right? It's a the lesser chimutz. So if the Torah says Chametz is asur b'balira b'yimatzeh, then, and it doesn't mention Seor, then I could assume that Seor is also asur. Because why? Because it's not Chametz, it's od yoter. It's chimutzo kasher. So now the question is going to be, now you understand. Now we bring it back into this whole framework. So is there going to be a more severe aspect to Seor than to Chametz? So based on the, okay, so here. Now let's look at Rashi. Shiro shel zeh lo kashiro shel zeh. So what do we learn? We understand as follows, that if the Torah had just said, that it's asur to be in possession of chametz on Pesach, and it hadn't said anything about suor, then I would have said as follows. I would have said, "Uma chametz she'en chimutzo kasher asur b'gazayit, suor shechimutzo kasher lo kol shekain." What if, just as chametz, that is right, it's a lighter form of chametz, of something that's chamutz, and it's asur b'gazayit. What does it mean that it's asur b'gazayit? How do I know that a chametz is asur b'gazayit? What does it mean that chametz is asur b'gazayit? Okay, I should have. We talked about it last time, but let's flesh this out a little bit. So when we're talking about chametz and even suor on Pesach, we have, broadly speaking, we have two problems, right? Right, there are two isurim. You're not allowed to eat chametz, and you're not allowed to possess chametz, right? So it's asur ba'achila, and it's asur b'bal yirai b'al yimatzeh. You can't see it, and it can't be found. So those are two separate issues. The Torah goes out of its way in chametz to make it more chamur than other isurei achila, right? So let's say if you happen to have in your home a piece of pork, you're not over on anything by having the pork in your possession, but you're not allowed to eat it. Mashein ken b'chametz, you're not even allowed to own it, and it's not allowed to be in your domain, right? So this is an extra thing. So now, when I say I'm starting from a baseline that it's asur ba'achila. You're not allowed to eat chametz. And what's the basic shiur for isurei achila?
Kazayit.
Kazayit. In other words, I don't have, in general, this is the accepted idea that unless I have reason to say otherwise, my baseline for saying that something is asur b'achila is it's going to be asur. Okay, you should be explicit. It's asur b'kol shehu, but you won't be chayav a punishment unless you eat a kazayit.
What does when you say there is no batel b'shishim? So what do you mean by this case?
What do you mean? There's no batel b'shishim?
So there's no way, you shouldn't have it even for 0.0%. You shouldn't have it at all. So it's not kazayit, or maybe I don't understand that.
Okay, so let's go back and read this. Let's go back and read this all together. Okay. Rav Zvi Amar Kotevet Hagasa Shamru Chasra Mikabetza. That's where we're starting from. Rav Zvi he asserts that the Kotevet Hagasa that they said in regard to Yoma, in our Mishnah here in Yoma, it's a little bit less than a Kabetza. How does he know? Did not, because I learned in the Mishnah, Beit Shammai Omrim, Sor Bekazayit Chametz Bekikotevet. So last week we saw the Mishnah. This is a machoka between Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, and Beit Hillel says that they're both Bekazayit. Both Sor and Chametz are Asur Bekazayit for Bal Yirai, Bal Yimatzeh, but Beit Shammai says no. When it comes to Bal Yirai, Bal Yimatzeh, they have a different shiur. Sor is Bekazayit, and chametz is b'kikotevet. So if you have even a kazayit of seor in your house, you're chayav a chatat. But for chametz, you would have to have at least a kikotevet to be chayav b'yirai b'yimatzeh. Even though, and now we'll put this in our minds, even though if you ate a kazayit of chametz on Pesach, you would be already chayav a chatat for eating the chametz. But you won't be over on Bal Yirai Bal Yimatzeh unless you own or have in your possession at least a kikotevet of chametz. Okay, so that's just to understand Beit Shammai. So now Gemara says, my time at the Beit Shammai. What's the reason for Beit Shammai that he gives these different shiurim? Because Beit Hillel holds that they're both bikazayit. Why does Beit Shammai differentiate? So he goes like this: Nichtov Rachmana chametz v'lo bai saor. The Torah could have just written chametz, and I wouldn't need it to say saor. And then I would say anamina. I would say ma chametz shein chimutzo kasher asur b'kazayit. Just as chametz, right, that has a lighter chimutz, it's asur b'kazayit for eating. In other words, that's my baseline. That I know for eating, it's going to be asur b'kazayit. So saor shechin, but what's our concern? We're talking about bayirai bayimatze. So saor shechinutzo kasher lo kol shekain. Won't it be that saor has to be even more, right? Even more so that he's going to be over on bayirai bayimatze with the saor. So. Okay, so we know that we have one shiur of kazayid, and now I say mida balginhu rachmana. So now that the Torah has differentiated between saor and chametz, limdalach, it teaches you that shiur shozeh lo kashiro shozeh. It introduces an idea now that I have to differentiate between the shiur of chametz and the shiur of saor. For this matter of Bayirai Bayimatze. And so now what? I have to assign one of them the shiur of Kazayit, because that's the only shiur that I know to begin with. And that's the baseline shiur. And then, but one of them then has to be Yoter Kal. So as Michael Werner explained at the beginning of the class, Saor b'kazayit, I'm going to say that this kazayit, I'm going to assign that now to the saor. Because saor is chimutzo kasher, so it should be yoter chamur. So I'll be over on bayirai bayimatze with even a kazayit. And now it means I have to assign a greater shiur to chametz for bayirai bayimatze. So Beit Shammai says, I'm going to assign it the shiur of kotevet. That's it. And so it tells me, okay, so far so good. In terms of the context of our sugya here, the Gemara then goes on to say, V'yisal kadata kotevet hagasa shamru yitera michbeitza nichte Beit Shammai shiur denafish mikazayit kamahadri litnika beitza. Right. Actually, you know what? I'll explain that in a moment because I still want to finish explaining Rashi on this part of the Gemara. So now this is what Rashi is saying. Once the Gemara says, Shiru shozeh lo kashiru shozeh, I've come to the conclusion. Beit Shammai says, look, the fact that the Torah went out of its way to mention both chametz and saor tells me that the shiurim are differentiated. So al korchach the chametz nafish mikazayit lahachi katav saor. It must be to tell me that chametz has a greater shiur than a kazayit, and that's why it told me saor. Di lo katve, if the Torah had not written it, had not written saor, the gamar mi chametz, and it just learned it out as from like a kol mechomer from chametz. Havamina daya lavo min hadin liot kanidon. Then I would say, like Michael Schwartz said earlier in this year, it's enough for me to say that that saor is asur just like chametz. It's enough for me to take the minimum and say, if I'm now going to add in saor to the isur of bayirai bayimatze, I'll say dayo. It's enough for it to be just like chametz. I only make you chayav for this with a larger shiur. That's why the Torah wrote saor to make it to give you a chiyuv for just having a kazayit. If you want to argue that it writes seor so that you should be chayav on even less than a kazayit, that much we wouldn't say. Because we don't want to make riyah, in other words, the isur of bal yera'eh, that should not be more chamur than eating it itself. The fact that the Torah gives us the isur of bal yera'eh, I have to assume that's not worse than eating it. The stam achila, and so what do we say? Stam achila b'kazayit. Al korcha chachamur b'kazayit, v'hakal b'yoter mikazayit. So therefore, so this is the logic. So once I say that the Torah went out of its way to mention seor, and I don't have to learn it out from a kol v'chomer from chametz, it must be if I had learned it out from a kol v'chomer from chametz, I would have assigned it the same shiur because I would have said dayo. It's enough for me just to learn it out from chametz and say it's asur v'gamarnu. The fact that the Torah goes out of its way to tell me that seor is asur, it must mean to assign it a different shiur. And so my reason is going to go like this. The minimum, the baseline shiur that I have is I'm going to learn from achila, which is conceptually at least worse than, or at least as bad as seeing it, right? Because b'chol Torah kula, something that's asur to eat is asur to eat, and not necessarily asur to see, but I have this special din by chametz that I'm also not allowed to see it. So I'm going to assign whatever is chamur in this case between the chametz and the seor. I have to differentiate between the shiurim. I'll give the more chamur shiur to the seor, because the seor is chimutzo kasher. And so the minimum shiur is going to be kazayit, not less than a kazayit, but a kazayit. If I have a kazayit asur on Pesach, I'm over on bal yirai bayimatzeh. Now I have to assign a greater shiur to chametz. So on that, Beit Shammai says, I'll say it's a kotevet. And that's how Beit Shammai learns. So that, I hope, was a little bit more revealing than we did last week. But let's go on. So we still haven't, but at this point in the Gemara, I still haven't proven Rav Zvid. So Rav Zvid said, Kotevet hakasa shemru chasra mikabetza. I'm still trying to determine exactly where do I put Kotevet hakasa on the scale of shiurim. So I know it's greater than Kazayit, but I don't know if it's greater than a kabetza or less than a kabetza. Paul, what did you want to say?
Just to ask, according to Beit Hillel, there is no difference between the Shnei Shiurim?
There's no difference.
No,
Right,
this is the way today we
that's
go
the way we
according to Beit Hillel. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Right. Excuse me. Right. Last week we looked at it. It's the first Mishnah in Beitza. And it's also a Mishnah in Eduyot. And this is one of the cases where it's one of the few cases where Beit Shammai is Mekil and Beit Hillel is Machmir. Right? Because now they both agree on the shiur for Seor, but Beit Hillel is Machmir to say that you're also over in Bayirai Bayimatzi with the Kazayit of Hametz. And Beit Shammai says, no, not until you have a Kotevet. And that's why it's brought in the context in Masechet Beitza. Anyway, okay, so Rav Zvid said Kotevet HaKasa is less than a Kabetza. How do I know? I'm going to learn it in this way. I'm going to look at Beit Shammai, and in the context of Seor and Chametz and Bayirai Bayimatz on Pesach. And I'm going to say, what was Beit Shammai's reasoning? His reasoning was the Torah could have just written Chametz, and then I would have known Seor, because obviously Seor is going to be Asur, because it's Chimutzo Kasher. So I would have just learned as a Kol Sheken, as a Kal V'chomer, from Chametz, just as Chametz is Asur b'Bayirei Bayimatze, certainly Seor is Asur b'Bayirei Bayimatze. And Chametz, I would say, at what point am I over on Bayirei Bayimatze? If I have a Kazayit, because I'm not going to make, I won't make the Isur of Bayirei Bayimatze more chamur than the Isur of Achila. Seder. So if the Torah had not written Seor, I would have said that Seor is the same shiur as Chametz. But now that the Torah has written Seor, I understand that the Torah wants me to differentiate the shiurim. And so I know that the shiur of one is not the same as the shiur of the other. So now I'm going to assign the kazayit to the Seor, because that would be the chamur case. If I make the Chal V'chomer, that's the Chamur case. So I'm going to say that's Asur B'Kazayit. And Chametz will be the larger shiur. It'll be a Kotevet. Okay. Ad Kan, this is the understanding of Beit Shammai in that Mishnah regarding Bayirai Bayimatze. Gemara says, V'isal Kadatach. Now we're coming back to our issue with Reb Zvid. If you would think that Kotevet Hagasa Shamru Yitzera Michabeitza, if you would think that it's a greater shiur than a kibetza, then then how does this make sense? Michde Beit Shammai Ashiura Denafish Bikazayit Kamahadre. Beit Shammai, in that Beit Shammai, is looking for a shiur that's greater than a kazayit, right? We laid out the whole argument. He has to assign a greater shiur, a shiur greater than a kazayit to chametz. Then, if he was just looking for a greater shiur, litne kibetza. We know that kibetza is more than a kazayit. He could have just said chametz b'kibetza. Bi'inami, maybe you'll say ki hadadi nini. Maybe you'll say, yeah, granted, he could have said kibetza, and actually Kotevet Hagasa is the same shiur as kibetza. In that case, right, it just happens to be that they both have the same shiur. In that case, litne kibetza, then he should have said kibetza. Why would he have said kibetza instead of Kotevet Hagasa if they're the same?
Bates is a common measurement.
It's a more common measurement. We see it in many other places. We don't see Kotevet Hagasa anywhere except here on Yom Kippur. So he should have said kibetza. So what we're doing through is we're trying to knock through how I get to the conclusion that Kotevet Hagasa must be less than a kibetza. If it was more than a kibetza, why would he make it more than a kibetza? All he needs is a shiur that's greater than a kazayit. So he should have gone and said kibetza. Maybe you'll say, yeah, but maybe actually the kibetza and the Kotevet are the same shiur. In that case, he also should have said kibetza because it would be easier for us to relate to. So ela love. So what's left? Shmamina Kotevet chutami kibetza. So the only possibility is that Kotevet Hagasa is less than a kibetza. So then the Gemara says, Mimai. But why would you say that? Dilma, because I could make a counter argument. Dilma lo'olam eimalach Kotevet Hagasa shamru yitzera michebetza. Maybe the Kotevet Hagasa that they said by Yom Kippur is really greater than a kibetza. And as to your argument about why he wouldn't have stopped at kibetza, why would he say Kotevet Hagasa? Hastama kibetza. actually, let's be careful with our language here, because Beit Shammai didn't say chametz b'kikotevet hagasa. He said chametz b'kikotevet stam. Hastama kebetza. Then what I could say is that actually stam kotevet, like Beit Shammai is saying, is actually ekabetza. V'inami ki hadadi minhu, v'chadi minayu nakat. In other words, it could be that kotevet is the same as the kibetza. It's neither bigger nor smaller, and if you say that they're the same, he chose the nomenclature of kotevet instead of kibetza for no particular reason. Okay, let's just finish off today by looking at Rashi here. Nichte Beit Shammai. Right, so this is the part of the Gemara where the Gemara is saying, the Gemara is making the argument for Rav Zvid, or Rav Zvid himself is making this argument. I learned from Beit Shammai that I have to differentiate between Seor and Chametz, and now I want to understand about this about the Kotevet Hagasa, that it must be greater than a Kibetza. What's the argument? Nichte Beit Shammai Ashiur Denafish Mikazai Kamahadre. Start off with this idea that Beit Shammai now has to find a shiur that's greater than a kazayit to assign the seor. So Rashi says, Michte Beit Shammai lo amru kikotevet ela mishum debau shiur chametz tfei mishel seor. The only reason that they said this term of kotevet, this shiur of kotevet, because they need a shiur of chametz that's going to be greater than seor. Shehu b'kazayit, the seor is b'kazayit. Midi'itzrich krav michtavinu, because the Torah had to write it. That's the whole argument that we had before. Since the Torah had to write seor, and it already it wrote chametz, and it also wrote seor. So as we said, I understand that seor is going to be, in this case, the smaller shiur, which is in context of Bayirai Bayimatze, is the more chamur aspect. You're chayav with even a smaller shiur, but now I need a greater shiur to assign to chametz. Matzu shiur pachot mikikodevet v'hu yeter al kazayit hayu misharin bo. So if they could find a shiur that's less than a kotevet, but is greater than a kazayit, that's what they would measure with. In other words, all I need to do for Beit Shammai to make sense is to find a shiur that's greater than a kazayit. So they could have found something that was less than a kikotevet, but it's still more than a kazayit. That's what they would use, because, and here I'll add in, because all I need to do is find a greater shiur that's relatable. So I can't just say, I hope this doesn't confuse people, but so why didn't you say kazayit for chametz, I'm sorry, kazayit for seor, and kazayit plus a little more? Because
why not kibetza? I don't understand.
Wait, so let me go through the
Kibetza is bigger than the kazayit. Why would you use this very rare this kotevet, which is very rare? You could have used the betza.
Okay, so that's part of the argument here. But let's go. Let me just clarify something. If I know, these are the following things that I'm assuming now based on Beit Shammai, that a minimum shiur is going to be a kazayit, and I have two things that I have to assign a shiur to. I have to assign a shiur to chametz and to seor. The other thing I know is that they don't have the same shiur. And the other thing I know is that seor is going to get the smaller shiur because it's more chamur. Okay. So now what am I left with? I have to find another shiur for chametz that's greater than a kazayit. So I'm just interjecting here parenthetically. So why doesn't Beit Shammai say seor b'kazayit v'chametz b'kazayit v'od k'tzat?
Mhm.
Okay, why do you think that doesn't? Nobody mentions this. Why do you think that's the case? Why don't we just say a little bit more than a kazayit?
Because a little bit more is a subjective measure, and we're in the realm of objective measures.
Okay, so first, in principle, yes. Although I could say, let's say a kazayit is, I don't know, 100 grams. So I'll say anything more than 100 grams. It's not so unreasonable to do it. But I'm going to take the second part of what Michael said to say we're in objective measures. It's not so much that it's subjective, because I could say even the tiniest amount. But what's the point? I need to give people measures that are relatable. So there's an accepted sort of system of measurement where I already have measures of kazayit and I have kibetza. And there I want to make sure that I think part of it's not completely different than what Michael's saying, but I also want to make sure that there's a clear distinction between these two shiurim. So I have to make it more than just a tiny bit. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to use measurements that we know from other places that people already are familiar with. Okay. So now
And that we also have the fact that these measurements aren't really exact.
But we're going to leave that aside.
The zayt could be 100% and also 102% or something like this. 100 gram or 102 grams. So
okay, so we discussed that I think 2 weeks ago, right? That was the question that came up a couple of weeks ago, and you see that actually in the even from the Mishnah that there are Tanaim that hold that for certain shiurim, it's based on the subjective experience of the person at that moment. So let's leave aside the question of whether these are absolute measures or maybe they're relative to the circumstance. But we know absolutely that for the purposes of this type of measurement, that kazayit is much smaller or it's noticeably smaller than a kibetza. So now, Michte Beit Shammai lo amru kikotevet ela mishum debar shiur chametz tvei mishel sor. In that, Beit Shammai only invoked the shiur of kotevet because they need a shiur that's greater than chametz for seor. Shehu pikazayit, and that I'm going to assign the shiur of kazayit to the seor, which we argued a couple of lines earlier. Because the Torah went out of its way to write it. So now, why does Beit Shammai use the shiur of kotevet? Imatzu shiur pachot mi kotevet, v'hu yeter al kazayit hayu misharin bo. If in that all they need is a greater standard shiur than kazayit, so if the kotevet, even atzu shiur pachot bika kotevet v'hu yeter al kazayit, if they found a shiur that was less than the kotevet and greater than the kazayit, they would have used that for the measurement. So im kabetzak pchuta mikotevet litnei kabetza. So if the kabetza would be less than the kotevet, then it would stand to reason that Beit Shammai would have given the shiur of kabetza to the chametz. The inami ki hadadi. Maybe you'll say that they're the same shiur, that actually it's just two names for the same shiur, kazayit and kotevet. In that case, lema kabetza. Then they should have said kabetza. Shu shagur b'mishnah yoter mi kotevet. It's more commonly used. Linyan, and for where linyan tumat ochlin.
But it's usually bigger.
It's usually it's a common shiur that we use in regard to, for example, Rashi says tumat ochlin, that it has.
It's probably bigger than a kotevet.
So that right. So then we have to assume that it's bigger than a kotevet, because otherwise, Beit Shammai should have said kibetza, right? So either if you argue that it's bigger, it doesn't make sense. The only way it makes sense, if you argue that it's bigger or the same as the kibetza, it doesn't make sense. But what would make sense is if the kotevet is less, because now I have seor b'kazayit. I need a larger shear, so I'll say the next largest shear is a kikotevet, and that's why Beit Shammai picked it. And this supports Rav Zvid's contention that the kikotevet shamru is kikotevet akasa shamru is less than a kibetza. But on this, the Gemara now pushes back, and the Gemara says, no, mimai. Why do you say that, or why do you have to say that? Dilma liolamei melach. Maybe I could always say to you like this: Kotevet hagasa shamru yitei rami kibetza. That what are we talking about in Yoma? We're talking about Kotevet hagasa. And that actually is greater than a kibetza. Hastama kibetza. But stam, when it's not qualified, it's just simply called a kotevet, I could say that's the same as a kibetza. And as Rashi says, Beit Shammai kotevet stama amur. Beit Shammai, in their Mishnah, they don't say kotevet agasa. They say kotevet. So I'll say hastama kibetza, and if the stam kotevet is like kibetza, I could say that they're like the same, and he chose to use the term kotevet instead of kibetza. So at this point in the Gemara, after all of this shaklavataria, I still don't have a proof for Rav Zvid to say that the kotevet agasa she'amru is less than a kibetza. I still don't have that proof. So next week we're going to look at the next proof, and that's the proof from the sugya in Brachot, where the sugya says, Ad kama mizamnin, ad kazayit, divrei Rabbi Yehuda, divrei Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad kibetza. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at next week. I encourage you all to read ahead, and Bezrat Hashem. We'll see you next week.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Nice.
Bye-bye.
תודה רבה.
Tov.